Dismantling the master's house through television. Bearing witness in the OA. Knowledge is rumor until it lives in the body. The OA. Away. 3157. It is not common to find an assertion that a Netflix show relies heavily on a type of witnessing that can be translated through theory and poetry better than genre conventions, one that cannot be understood through a linear timeline or a colonial framework, but Netflix says the OA is not your common show. Netflix launched the show with little fanfare, releasing only a found footage style video clip of a woman jumping off a bridge about 5 or so days before its release. Instead of clarifying itself through a solid genre, narrator, or story, the OA continues to replicate its release date enigma in real time by shifting genres heavily and throwing viewers unconventional plot twist after unconventional plot twist. As a result, the show has amassed thousands of fan theories online, with many viewers creating communities dedicated to decoding both the OA and its eponymous character, the OA. The non-traditional name is one of the first hints writer, producer, and star Britt Marling places in the show, giving viewers a hint at the kind of destabilizing narrative they're about to be immersed in. However, part of the problem viewers are having with the OA is that they're trying to decode it at all. The show makes no qualms about its purpose as a story, first and foremost, and it uses those destabilizing elements like genre-bending, unreliable narrators, and plot twists that undermine huge cultural assumptions like the ability of language to communicate effectively in order to ensure viewers only have the story to hold on to for stability and grounding as the show unfolds. It is here, at the intersection of unfolding and destabilization, that the OA is the most challenging to watch and digest. In The Poetics and Politics of Witnessing, Derrida explores what witnessing looks like, what it means to be towards the other. The OA embodies, insomuch as a concept that relies on a polyphony of voice and infinitude of possibility can be embodied, the Derridian concept of witnessing. It achieves a sort of telling about telling by utilizing tools that are, to invoke Audre Lorde, decidedly not the master's, and so creates a narrative that confounds as much as it entertains. The OA unabashedly uses the knowledge of her body, instead of just the mind, to open up literal new worlds of possibility, which illustrate how a story outside of colonial conception of time, language, and knowledge might be told, but more importantly, experienced. Decisively, the OA is a narrative that shows what bearing witness looks, feels, and means through telling a story about a woman who decenters colonial ideologies and Enlightenment rationality in favor of the body, emotions, and relationships in order to reach towards the interstice of language and being and everything that space can mean. Although it feels antithetical to the performance of the show as a whole to dissect the work that the OA is doing to subvert power structures, it's important to ground the discussion of the OA within the narrative by explaining that narrative briefly. After all, it is the story, or the act of telling that story, that the show finds its most stable roots within, not other noteworthy filmic effects like mode, tone, and setting. The story begins with the titular character, the OA, jumping off a bridge in what looks like an effort to kill herself. She does not die, however, and is instead recovering inside of a hospital unit. Her parents go to meet her at the hospital, and it is there that the viewer discovers that her name is Prairie. She used to be blind, but has somehow regained her sight, and has been missing for 7 years. As the story progresses, Prairie ventures to find 5 people to tell her story to in an unfinished house in the suburbs. She tells these 5 people, 4 misfit boys and 1 grieving algebra teacher, that while she was gone for those 7 years, she was holed up by a captor named Hap, who abducted her and 4 other people because they had all previously had near-death experiences, NDEs, that changed their lives. Hap is killing them repeatedly and then reviving them in order to find scientific proof in an afterlife. He notes that people who have already experienced NDEs are much easier to revive than others, which is why he focuses on them in the first place. By virtue of experiencing so many NDEs, Prairie finds a way out of her prison through a kind of interdimensional travel unlocked through movements that must be practiced with others, and only through perfect feeling can the travel be found. The show revolves mostly on these movements and how Prairie lost the rest of the captives when, presumably, Hap took them to another dimension, and how she is trying to recreate the movements to get back the family that she made in capacity in order to save them. The summary here is necessarily very brief, and glazes over much of the details that will follow in this paper. But without some grounding in a basic narrative, it's easy to get lost in the story of the OA, even when immersed in it as a viewer. With the grounding of the basic plot tenets having been stated, it is now important to explore the ways in which narrative is presented in this show before delving into the anti-colonial tools it uses to realize that narrative. The OA is able to give viewers an immersive conceptual experience of bearing witness via testimony because it destabilizes many of the other elements of fiction that consumers of media typically rely on to move through a narrative. One of the first ways the show does this is through the destabilization of Prairie as a narrator, but also of her identity. As Prairie tells the story, she explains that she was adopted from Russia and her first name was Nina. Then her adopted parents named her Prairie, and as she travels through her NDEs, she acquires the name the OA. However, the latter name is described to be an articulation of sound instead of a word that denotes a name and identity. She says she feels it deep inside of her, but as soon as she says it in the world, it feels like she loses something of that knowledge. She says it sounds like, oh, oh, yes, so I. Several elements of destabilization are happening through Prairie's many and shifting names that are emblematic of the way the show creates a reliance on bearing witness in order to engage with the show at all. Each of Prairie's names offer a new, larger-than-life identity. Nina, the daughter of a rich Russian man who was driven out of her homeland by the mafia and lost her entire family. Prairie, the blind girl who gets abducted for 7 years. And the OA, a self-proclaimed angel who can travel through dimensions using her body, emotions, and connections with others. The OA is all of these identities, and perhaps a melding and transcending of identities, which is why the name is a sound instead of a word. The sound denotes nothing, or a perceived nothing, but in the space of perceived nothingness is an expression of knowledge that the OA believes in her body, and the sound is reaching at the liminal space that exists between words and the concepts they represent. Liminal space is not nothing, but it is also not something. In making the OA into a person who is best described as a sound, the show subverts the traditional genre convention of establishing a traditionally relatable protagonist to lead the narrative. Of course, none of this is to say that Prairie is not relatable in any way, but she is not wholly traditionally relatable. Prairie exemplifies how complicated it is to exist and how imbricated identities are within a single body. She is without apology, and her humanity is palpable, but it is not easily definable, which makes her pressing categorization not that of Nina or Prairie or even the OA, but of a storyteller. The show functions much in the same way the OA does, which is perhaps why the name of the show is the same as the main characters. Exploring multiple possibilities that can only exist if the viewer is willing to suspend the wish to categorize and instead simply be and bear witness. In Jacques Derrida's chapter on bearing witness entitled Poetics and Politics of Witnessing, Derrida articulates many of the facets of telling the OA performs throughout the show. When Prairie is trying to convey the experiences of her childhood in Russia, before she lost her sight, she tells everyone in attendance to close their eyes. She is trying to situate those around her deeply within themselves so that perhaps they will replicate her experiences through their own feelings, thereby making her part of themselves. It's also really interesting to note that the show seems aware of the fact that this is a retelling. Because of this self-awareness, and because the narrator is unreliable in the sense that the show's reality is constantly questioning her, it cannot be ruled out that the viewer may be bearing witness to any of the other five's interpretation of the OA's story. The camera zooms in on the eyes of some of the other five who are in the room, and then switches over to a more omnipresent storytelling, which suggests that the viewer is interpreting an interpretation of an interpretation. These degrees of separation from a raw actor experience is what makes the show uncomfortable to watch. Derrida describes part of this process of removal and telling as such. These things that are not only words. The poet is the only one who can bear witness to them. But he does not name them in the poem. The possibility of a secret always remains open, and the reserve inexhaustible. The OA is a story she understands and is more than words, which is part of why she has those in the room close their eyes. In addition, though, the possibility of interpretation, because of the impossibility of perfect testimony and transference of witness, leaves open for those secrets Derrida discusses. Every storyteller, then, is an unreliable narrator, since they rely on the subjectivity of self as translated by the grasping sounds of language. In every word there lies the possibility and probability of a secret or an opening. There is space in each telling, but in also each imagination of that telling. In the OA, Prairie fills the space and repeatedly asks those who are listening to her story to take another step that is necessary in order to bear witness, to trust her. In that first episode, the OA gathers everyone around her and says, "You have to pretend to trust me until you actually do." Moments later, she has everyone close their eyes, and at the end of the first episode, the title credits finally roll and the story begins. In addition to the introduction of the concept of the nonlinearity of time, which will be revisited when discussing how the OA utilizes tools that are not the Masters, the show is performing the concept of presence and trust that is necessary when bearing witness. Derrida says that bearing witness is not proving, and it appeals to an act of faith. The act of faith is what the OA is asking not only those in the room to promise, but also the viewers. The entire show hinges on whether or not the viewer believes Prairie, and similar to her cohort, the viewer has to give her story the benefit of the doubt in order to continue watching the show, since most of the screen time is devoted to her telling. Derrida nuances the concept of proving and believing out when he says, "I do not mean I prove, but I swear that I saw, I heard, I touched, I felt, I was present. I bear witness means I affirm, rightly or wrongly, but in good faith sincerely, that what was, it, or is present to me in space and time, thus sense perceptible, and although you do not have access to it, not the same access, you, my addressee, you have to believe me, because I engage myself to tell you the truth." The OA is telling the truth, at least of her feeling, her presence in her own life. Whether or not the events actually occurred as the viewer imagines, whether or not her dress is the exact same one she wore when she was abducted, or whether or not half sides are blue, Prairie is bearing witness to the veracity of her feeling and her being. She's not trying to prove her testimony with snippets of evidence like videos or pictures of her extraordinary life. In fact, the boys start looking her up in archival mediums when she first starts to tell them her story so they can verify her authenticity, and then gives themselves to her. But as she continues and makes connection through their shared presence in her steps, in her telling, they stop looking for evidence on the internet. They only engage in trying to find that evidence again when her authenticity is called into question later in the show. The OA shows how engaging with the other in good faith is to abandon a provable, rational, enlightenment idea of veracity and testimony. Proving testimony is necessarily outside of capture, and so those pictures the boys were unearthing cannot prove her story. The OA is trying to convey the presence of what it was for her to die and love in a prison, which is an experience, or as Derrida says, those things, that is beyond and in between words, let alone enlightenment ideas of evidence. The concept of bearing witness is complicated by the ways in which the story creates an adherence to that principle in order to engage with the show, which is often through ideas that challenge, subvert, or diminish the ability of colonial and enlightenment ideals to allow the other to bear witness. A colonial framework presupposes that time is linear, that language is objective and real meaning, that enlightenment ideas of rationality and phallogocentrism are more true than emotions. Derrida discusses why bearing witness is not proving, which is exactly why a story like the OA's cannot use a colonial framework to present a story that viewers can bear witness to. The viewer simply has nothing to believe in colonial narratives, as there is no presence, only an intake of presumed objective reality. There is not towardness in a narrative that relies on colonial interpretations of reality, only an unveiling of some thing at the end of the story. This unveiling is much like a magic trick, where the audience holds on to the edge of their seats, and if the trick is flashy enough, the audience is pleased. Narratives that rely upon that colonial framework work much more like magic tricks. If the payoff is satisfying enough, the narrative is successful. The OA is concerned with creating a community of presence, of trying to tell a story as truly as possible, which necessitates space and the elimination of cheap tricks from storytelling. Therefore, in order for the viewer to more authentically bear witness to Prairie's story, the OA must engage in a presentation of narrative that depends on non-colonial conventions to be told. These tools that the show uses can be contextualized within Audre Lorde's framework of the Master's Tool. In her speech-turned-essay, The Master's Tool Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, Lorde discusses how using the tools of white supremacy, patriarchy, colonialism, colonial languages, and enlightenment ideas of truth will never dismantle power structures. For example, patriarchy cannot be dismantled by adhering to patriarchal standards of womanhood. To adhere to the standards is to uphold it, and it's impossible to tear down a system while you're simultaneously holding it up. As was previously mentioned, some of the examples of the Master's tools are concepts like linear time, empirical rationality, and colonizing languages, in this case English. They are assumptions one's perception of reality is based off of, which informs their relationship to the world and to the other. Lorde says that relying on assumptions that have built oppressive systems create a system that also oppresses being. She states, interdependency between women is a way to feel freedom which allows the I to be, not in order to be used, but in order to be creative. This is the difference between the passive be and the active being. The OA seeks to create interdependency between viewers, the story, and the characters through witnessing. The OA ensures the Derridian concept of witnessing through destabilizing preconceived notions of passive be so that the active being is engaged when watching the show. One of the first ways in which the show creates an authentic space to bear witness within is by engaging in a non-linear timeline. The viewer is entreated to Prairie's world by first going back in time with her, to her childhood. This first step does not seem so revelatory. Plenty of storytellers start from a place and time in the past to tell their stories in the present. However, what makes the OA unique in this aspect is the fact that almost the entirety of the show is told in this style, which would normally be considered a flashback. Flash, of course, implies quickness for transportation to a different time and place. In the OA, there is no quickness, as the show is oriented in a time that the viewer knows is not necessarily now. Even though the OA's story does not take place in the now, the viewers and those in the room with her are invited to feel it as though it were occurring in real time. It's interesting to note that for viewers, the entire story is all happening in the now. The viewer's first experience of presence towards the story, a bearing witness and resonating, unfolds not when these events happened for Prairie, but as these events are being told. Since Prairie is in a similar position to that of Derrida's concept of poet, and since Prairie is contextualizing her experience through language, which is already interpretation, a timeline of events is almost besides the point. Time in this space is less a line and more of an ocean, one in which thoughts, ideas, people, and experiences bump up against each other in different points of time and space. Prairie's past is the viewer's present, and the show illustrates this in a more literal way when the opening credits roll at the end of the first episode. The OA is performing a nonlinear timeline in a formal aspect of television, the crediting of actors, production crews, and writers. The medium of the OA allows for this metaperformativity that plays with destabilizing concepts that can make Western audiences disoriented, which creates a reliance on the narrative for grounding. Western audiences often rely on linearity of time to follow a story so that a conclusion can be reached. However, stories do not have neat conclusions, and in real life, a single origin or catalyst is often a myth. Storytelling in many genres is often watching a series of catalysts explode until they stop, presumably forever. The OA does not rely on catalyst after catalyst, but instead, following Prairie and her emotions as she transcends time and space, particularly in her NDEs. The OA's NDEs are a central focus of her story as they guide her experience, and subsequently those bearing witness to her story through the world. The fact that the show lands on NDEs as a major plot point exemplifies the idea of storytelling and the OA's experience as being within an interstitial space. An NDE is not quite death, but it is not life either. It is the closest thing to existing in an in-between, which forces Lorde's idea of an active being to the forefront of interpretation. Hap, because of his trust in empirical reasoning, is seeking to find the location of that in-between. He wants to know where his captives go when they die. Usually when someone invokes the idea of going, somewhere in death, they do not necessarily mean a physical place. However, Hap insists on there being one because an empirical worldview necessitates physical borders and an idea of objective, definable reality. Brit Marling, the creator of the OA, as well as the star of the show, seems to understand that there exist liminal spaces that can perhaps only be felt, and that is part of the reason why she settled on NDEs, which are typically aligned with the science fiction genre. She states, "I believe in what science fiction can do, which is it can set up a simple rule that it has to follow to try to illuminate something about the present that is somewhat invisible to us. Except that even in that illumination, you have to admit that you just don't know, that some things are a capital M mystery that are beyond our five senses and we couldn't possibly perceive or articulate." So much of watching this show is the viewer admitting that, as Marley put it, you just don't know. Part of the challenge of writing this paper is that it is fighting to articulate feelings, actions, testimony that are beyond our articulation and perception. In order to speak, this paper needs the other. It needs someone to bear witness. That begs the question of whether or not an academic paper can convey the witnessing of witnessing, since it is so steeped within the institutional traditions that resist bearing witness, if not seeking to bar it entirely. Papers assume ownership, not community. The OA faces a similar dilemma in trying to utilize a form, television, that frequently upholds colonial institutions, particularly through language. Marling addresses the limitation of telling a story through language by transcending the spoken word in order to find other ways for her characters to communicate to others and viewers. Her interesting view towards spoken language was discussed a little earlier, but perhaps her most compelling way of communication is through dance and the body. The OA's story really picks up when she experiences a particular NDE under Hap's supervision that was not part of his experiment. Because Prairie is blind, and because he happened upon her talent, violin, bore witness to it, and then realized she was special, instead of tracking her down as part of his experiment, he sees Prairie as a human instead of a test subject. He trusts her and allows her into his home instead of always locked up in a glass cage with the others. One day, she finds a means to escape, pushes Hap down the stairs, and tries to run blindly to freedom. Hap catches her by knocking her in the back of her head with the butt of a rifle. She experiences an NDE in which she enters a place that looks like an infinite galaxy. There, she finds a woman named Katun who tells her she can escape her prison through a gift. Katun gives Prairie a bird, a living thing, which she swallows and then wakes up. When she wakes up, she says she feels different, like that knowledge is living inside of her, fluttering. She can also hear that knowledge being articulated deep in her bones, but not through a word. She can only hear it, which was discussed earlier when she lands on the name the OA. Her knowledge sounds like the OA, but she admits she loses it as soon as she speaks it into the world. She realizes, however, that she can articulate that knowledge, but it's not through just her mind, it's through her body as well. The OA manifests the knowledge that comes from her liminal beyond in her NDEs through what she calls movements. It is worth discussing that the OA has a very strong connection to one of her fellow captives, Homer. Homer and the OA are very much partners, plotting how to escape with each other and forming a special bond through their glass prisons. He gives her strength and she gives him purpose. Homer is perhaps the first person in the OA's life who authentically bears witness to her being in the world. When she starts fluttering her arms about while she sleeps, he believes her when she says the movements are a wisdom her body was given. He then practices the movements with her and even acquires another movement in his own NDE. She taps into this knowledge by listening to her body and practices these movements over and over again until she is mentally and physically exhausted. The OA states that she's trying to get to a space of perfect feeling, and only then can the movements work to create a new language, a new way of being that will bend her material reality and literally free her and the others from Hap. In her speech, Use of the Erotic is Power, Audre Lorde discusses the force that the OA is feeling, pulsing through her cells, and calls it the erotic. Lorde starts, "The erotic is a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feelings. The reason Prairie cannot articulate the movements through language is because it is unrecognizable as such. The closest she can get to expressing her erotic knowledge is to practice the movements until she reaches a plane wherein she can feel those feelings. It is in this deepness of feeling, a concept also introduced by Lorde, that the OA wishes and needs to connect with others to make a material change. The movements are revealed to be a means of interdimensional travel. Prairie explains this by stating that dimensions lie entangled on top, in line, and woven into one another. She says that one can open a lane of travel into another dimension by deeply feeling these movements with the others. In the sense of the erotic, what the OA is proposing is that each person practices honing in on their most erotic selves and truths and syncs them through rhythmic movements that help create a shared, deep, and personal connection to both the erotic and towards the other. The movements are the culmination of bearing witness while using the erotic as power, and what the show is stating about the possibility of that power is something really revelatory. Not only does the OA explore the idea of bearing witness and the erotic as being hugely powerful when explored in tandem, but the show is also stating that these concepts in practice are powerful enough to travel through time and space. Interestingly enough, the OA never discusses finding some sort of rupture in time and space and then exploiting that failure in the fabric of being, but instead she describes jumping into currents to harness the interconnectedness of dimensions and selves. Prairie tells her friends back home that I need to cross a border that's hard to define. This reality she is discussing is pliable, complicated, and nuanced. It's not defined by the harshness of colonial notions of place, identity, or language. However, the OA believes that finding that place and crossing these borders is a process that is free from conquering, from manipulation, or from any sort of exploitation. It makes sense that the erotic and bearing witness would be an orientation with and through instead of without and around. Prairie and the OA, by proxy, are exploring the connectedness of feeling and what it is to be more authentically in relation to another, and not surprisingly, it is at this point that plenty in the audience turn the show off. A piece in Vulture picked up on the way many in online communities that were excited about the OA were experiencing. An unscientific survey of online chatters seems to identify the movements as the point of the series, around episode 5, where one kind of viewer gets excited to see something she's never seen before, and another declares it bonkers and flees. Brit Marling has a theory on why so many audience members flee. She believes we hate the body in this country. We're ashamed about our bodies. The first couple of times we perform the movements, everybody laughs. The laughter comes from embarrassment. The embarrassment comes from fear. The fear comes from vanity. Marling is discussing the shame that a culmination of oppressive power structures like patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, and empiricism causes people within those power structures to feel. A cursory Google search will reveal that the movements are a punchline for many people online, and it might be worth it to dedicate an entire paper to the masculinized space of media and internet, and why it is that many in these spaces would reject ideas about the body so derisively. Regardless, viewership in a non-fictionalized reality seem to be made uncomfortable by the movements. And their discomfort relates back to the destabilization that the narrative causes in the viewer. That destabilization is sometimes so evident that it drives viewers away, but it's much more difficult to stay with Prairie, to open oneself up to the possibility of her testimony, than it is to shut down and close out either. The OA is a narrative that folds in on itself, but does not collapse. It is in its own complicated stability that it destabilizes the viewer. Prairie is so confident in her ethereal tale that opening it up requires an almost visceral vulnerability, even though it's fiction. If Prairie is indeed telling the truth, then alternate dimensions do exist, and the possibility of bearing witness and erotic power are real. Even though the narrative folds, it does not complete itself. With each fold, each additional bearing of witness, every testimony and movement, the narrative becomes more connected and intricate. Derrida discusses this unfolding, expanding as the sealing and unsealing of witness. The OA, then, is performing its own ideas of interdimensionality, the possibility of another dimension being on top of another dimension ad infinitum, by exploring these possibilities within the OA's own narrative structure. Of course, it is important to note that much like the narrative structure this paper is describing, it's also impossible to fully articulate the extra-linguistic in-betweens that exist within the OA. It's also impossible to completely bear witness, as this paper is trying to do, through the other not also bearing witness. The construction of this paper could not exist without the collaboration of relationship, of towardness. The ideas expressed within this paper do not fully exist without being realized in relation. And this is what a genuine idea of presence does. It perpetuates. Bearing witness to something or someone which is also borne witness cannot be contained in a singular articulation. Bearing witness necessitates the interstice, which means this paper cannot bear a full testimony by itself, as it is too constrained in words in the academy. It has a thesis and introduction, and most importantly, a conclusion. Bearing witness does not end, because it does not depend on linearity in the first place. Conclusively, the OA is a story that relies above all else on the presence of its viewers. It utilizes destabilizing elements in order to create a space for an authentic telling and revealing of self in order to foster an environment that one can bear witness within. In bearing witness, the show seals and unseals its own telling, creating a narrative that is revelatory. The OA tries to live in a space of testimony and erotic power, one that is so powerful that it can travel through alternate dimensions and save loved ones. Brit Marling, however, knows that she, like all people who tries to convey witness, can only grasp at the unknowable. But perhaps she said it best in her interview with Malcolm Gladwell when she was quoting author Clarice Lispector. Reality is the raw material. Language is the way I go in search of it, and the way I do not find it. but it is from searching and not finding that what I did not know was born, and which I instantly recognize. Language is my human effort. My destiny is to search, and my destiny is to return empty-handed, but I return with the unsayable. The OA is our attempt at writing and making a new human language through movement, this mythology we're inventing. And yet, we will of course fall short, but it's in the falling short, it's in the failure, in that gap that the audience feels the slightest wind of the unknowable, the unsayable, which is what we all basically feel all the time, that life and death and birth is this fantastic mystery that we cannot fully grasp, and that's an extraordinary thing to sit inside.